All right, welcome to Worldwide Workshop. Today we're doing a podcast series where I interview the architects of early childhood education in Nova Scotia. And today my guest is Susan Stacey.
Hi,
Hi.
glad to be here.
Could you just briefly introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
What I do, yeah. So, I'm Susan Stacey. I've been involved in early childhood education in many ways as an educator, for children, for adults. I write. I'm the author of 5 books about documentation and inquiry. And I'm a pedagogical partner to many people around the province and across the world, actually. I sometimes work with people in Hong Kong and out west in Canada, all over the place.
Mentor to me for sure. My first question for you is going way back. So when did you start in the ECE field and kind of what brought you to it?
That does go way back. What brought me to it was actually my own children when they were little. We were living in Montreal. They were like 1 and 3 when they started in childcare. The childcare center was associated with the college. It was a very high quality. I didn't know it at the time because I didn't know anything about early childhood. But what I was seeing actually was a really high quality early childhood program. Very warm and welcoming and inclusive. And this was back in the 1970s. So
Wow.
we're talking a long time ago. I didn't know anything about early childhood, but I was fascinated by what the staff were doing and how well they were doing it. I was intrigued. I hadn't thought about early childhood education before.
Mm-hmm.
I was trained as a pharmacy technician after I left school in England. That was my first profession. And so when I was ready to go back to school after my children were born, this is something I hadn't considered until I saw them in action.
Right.
Yeah.
And where was that center?
That was in Montreal, in Saint-Anne-de-Bellevue.
So what about when you first came to Halifax or Nova Scotia in general?
So in Nova Scotia, I started, again, it was through my children who were in the childcare centre, and they needed substitutes, and I didn't have any experience in early childhood. But they took me on in those days. You could be a substitute with no experience except to be a mom. And so I started as a substitute in a privately owned childcare centre, very occasional. And again, got hooked. This was in Dartmouth, and I got hooked and started training, and it all went from there.
All right. So you started kind of your first experience was in Montreal, and then you came to Dartmouth.
Yeah.
How did it compare at first? And kind of what is the time frame for that as well?
It would have been about, again, around 1980-ish, 82, the early 80s, when I came here and started to see childcare in Nova Scotia. I think it was a bit more traditional in Nova Scotia compared to Montreal. They didn't call their program or their curriculum anything special, but it was, didn't have a name, but it was very teacher-led, very thematic. And what I'd seen in Montreal was more, for its time, was more flexible, more open to the children and what they were doing, which appealed to me more.
Yeah, I've heard from some elders of mine that curriculum has this kind of pendulum swing where it goes to very child-led and then to very teacher-directed and science, math, and then very child-led again. So interesting that you kind of were in that pendulum swing in Montreal, came here, and it was on the other side.
Yeah. And eventually, as the years went by in Nova Scotia, of course, that changed. Everybody started thinking about, brain research and reading the books that were coming out of Reggio, Emilia, which changed our perspective a lot. And, over the years, of course, here it became more and more emergent, inquiry-based, play-based, and leading to where we are now.
Amazing.
Yeah. It took some time.
Yeah. My first knowledge of Reggio Emilia comes from Malaguzzi and his speak on Image of the Child at the Convention for the Rights of the Child. I'm not saying I knew it then, but that is the first bit of information I have about his theories coming to North America. How soon or how close to that time period had you discovered Reggio Emilia?
I discovered Reggio Emilia when I was working at Peter Green Hall. So we have both worked on many occasions. I've been in and out of Peter Green Hall for years. in many different roles, but I was working there as a program coordinator. And Barb Bigelow at the time was there, and she was always looking for what's new, what's innovative, what can we do that's different. And Hilary Marantet, another architect of Nova Scotia back in that time, Nova Scotia Early Childhood at that time, was a friend and a colleague, and she came in and introduced us to the 100 Languages of Children. So that was the first book that I read about by the educators in Reggio Emilia. And both Bob and I were absolutely intrigued, and a little flyer, a little sort of inconspicuous flyer, landed on our desk in the office. I don't know how they found our name. They were in Washington, D.C., the Model Early Learning Center. They were in D.C. I don't know how this little flyer arrived on our desk. We'd never heard of them. And so they were doing a study tour. And they had Emilia Gambetti, Reggio Emilia, in residence with them, in partnership with them for a year. Can you imagine? I mean, that would be just mind-blowing. So they were doing study tours. And of course, we applied to the board. We begged, please, send us to D.C. And we did. We went for 3 days on this study tour in Washington, D.C. And that was transformational. Because Emilia Gambetti wasn't there anymore. Jennifer Agagliati was a pedagogical leader, had a close relationship with Emilia Gambetti. We saw documentation for the first time at the Model Early Learning Center. And that, as I said, was transformational for me. And I write about that experience in my books a lot as an introduction, because it changed my image of the child. It changed the way we can explain and make visible how they think and their ideas, and pay respect to what they're doing. So that visit was, I came back to Peter Green Hall, and I had a million ideas in my head, and I started doing documentation right away. This again would have been in the late 80s, early 90s. Started doing documentation right away with the staff, including Bobby Lynn, who was there at that time as a staff person in the preschool room. And that first documentation was pretty awful. It wasn't very...
As it always is.
It wasn't very, reflective, but my journey with documentation actually began there. Total sort of immersion into that topic until I ended up teaching and writing about it.
Yeah, sometimes we've got to go on that journey of making it look like the thing that we think it's supposed to look like, and then start to understand it's actually not about what it looks like. It's about what else is there.
My students now, when I'm working with them, I'm just saying, it needs to be clean and professional, neat and tidy. But really, it's the content, it's the questions, it's the thinking that's behind it that really matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In Halifax, kind of what substantial changes happened in the early parts of your career?
After actually at that private childcare centre where I first started working, and I was sort of, taking courses and workshops at that time and building my knowledge, Liz Hicks and I actually met there at that particular setting. We worked in the after-school program together, but we decided we wanted to do our own thing. And so we started our own preschool, and we worked together. It's called Child's World Early Learning Center. And we worked together in that preschool, which was actually run out of my home. We had sort of an extra entrance and extra space. We worked together on that program for 7 or 8 years, I think. And I don't think we ever did the same thing twice in that program.
Right.
We were always looking for something new and trying to keep up with the field. Things were developing quickly at that time in terms of our knowledge base. And so, we were taking courses and workshops all over the place and trying to keep up with this fast sort of development at that time of what we know about children, the image of the child, the how we think about children. Themes were still around, and we certainly in our early days we used them because we didn't know any better.
Right.
But we were thinking hard in those days about what early childhood should look like.
I was going to ask you, you said you opened the center in your home.
Yeah.
Was this kind of a day-home model, or was it a licensed childcare model?
It was a licensed half-day nursery school preschool program. program. And so each group came in for half a day, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon. And so we had 3 groups on the go during the week.
Wow.
We weren't into documentation then yet. This was before that. But and so it was, we had to find connections between this Monday, Wednesday, Friday group. When they came in on Wednesday, we had to think about what they'd been doing on Monday. We didn't have a record of that because we didn't know about documentation at the time. And so it was all up here. But we tried to make it, cohesive and consistent, and tried always to be thinking of new ways to be innovative.
So next I was kind of interested in your perspective on your key role in the field of ECE.
I think there are a couple of things. I think my work with students with student teachers has been really key. I've worked many times in many places in lab schools, both here in Nova Scotia through the College of Early Childhood Education, and then in the United States, where we moved for 8 years for my husband's work. I was fortunate to work in 2 different lab schools, one at Purdue University, which was a big deal because that's a huge university with a good record and a lot of expectations. The lab schools were built as lab schools with observation booths for parents and for students. And, when you work in a lab school, you're in a goldfish bowl. You're being observed all the time, so you're always thinking about your practice and your interactions. But I was given a free rein. I was given complete autonomy, which I really valued, to be able to run the programming whichever way I wanted. And it was Emergent. I started, providing documentation for parents outside our classroom. So that was my sort of introduction to working with early childhood students. And I would have 3 students at a time in the classroom with me, and all the, modeling and evaluation and meetings that go with that. And then we moved to, and that was at Purdue University in Indiana, and we moved to New Hampshire, where I was very lucky to land on my feet there at a time in Concord when the local community college was building a brand new state-of-the-art school. I mean, how lucky was I to be there at that time? So I developed it literally from the ground up: the program, the furniture, hiring the staff, developing the philosophy. So that was a big thing for me. But way back with the College of Early Childhood Education, before I went to the United States, they had a lab school when I was working there too. So I've always worked with early childhood students and really valued that role. It's a really important role. So I think that's been a big, contribution. I hope to the field. I hope to have had a positive influence on them and their practice, which kind of continues to today, because I still work as a mentor and a collaborator and a pedagogical partner, where I'm needed, where I'm asked, on a very, part-time basis. But I still teach a course at the MAM, so I'm still involved with students. That's been a big thing.
Right.
And then my writing, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. That's been, I think, a big part. Like everything sort of evolved, and it's almost like the journey I was on led me to writing the books that I've written. And I try to make my books very accessible in that they are practical. The language is accessible. I intend for the books to be used rather than sitting on the shelf collecting dust, because you have to read it because it's my college course. But no, I want practitioners to be able to use the books. And I think that has happened as far as I can tell.
Well, you're right. My students do have to read your books because we learn from Susan Stacey's books all the time. But they take them with them. They're some of the only books I require them to purchase because they are such great books for practice and to look back on and to continue to challenge yourself. So, yeah. Yeah,
there were reflective questions at the end of each chapter, and I hope that those promote discussion for students or for practitioners who are working through things. Yeah. I hope the questions help. Yeah.
Well, they absolutely do, because what you reflect on while you're a student is completely different than what you reflect on when you're an ECE. And then again, when you kind of move up in the ECE world to more of a mentor role, even within your center, your reflections again are very different. So it changes every time, every kind of context that I read it. So it's working. So
Good.
well done. You mentioned that you were in Nova Scotia, in New Hampshire, and in Indiana. And a lot of people, I find, pick a spot, put in deep roots, and build their whole career and community around that. So I am just wondering kind of what benefits do you think you had from seeing the at least three different, even Montreal, 4 different perspectives on curriculum, way things are done, even the way government supports or doesn't support?
Yeah, that's true. And the government piece is huge. The support for professional learning, that's a huge piece. But I think for myself, I can't speak for anyone else. Some people feel much more settled, and it depends on your disposition, but some people feel much more settled and secure if they're in one place and they can build from that place. And it's wonderful to belong to a childcare centre for 25 years and see its growth and be a part of that. That's a wonderful thing. For myself, because I've moved a lot in my lifetime, I have taken aspects, bits and pieces of each place that I've been, each culture I've worked in. The bilingualism in Montreal, that aspect was a bit of a struggle for me because my French is not great, but I was there and I worked with it, and then the whole culture of the United States, especially these days, but even then, is completely different than the culture of Canada as a country, and so there's all this adaptation that has to take place. And when you're working in a new setting, like the lab school in New Hampshire, that's a huge responsibility because you're building from the foundation. You're right there at the very start. So all of those things had, I think, an influence on me, and I personally enjoyed it. I think the challenge was interesting to me, working in all these different places.
I find that those challenges, for me in my experience anyway, work like sandpaper. You know what I mean? You've got this basis of knowledge, thinking, care, and you go to a different place and you've got to adapt a little, like you said, and it's a challenge, but that challenge kind of takes away some of the superfluous stuff that's not necessary, and then you go to another place and you're fine again. And then the more different perspectives you have on your own adaptive practice, sticking to your own guns, essentially, you know your own theory better, having been in those different contexts.
Yeah, you learn to articulate that.
Yeah.
When you're working with different groups of people in different places, especially in different countries, I've worked with people in Singapore and Hong Kong and overseas. You really have to be able to articulate your thoughts and your values. You have to be pretty secure in your values.
Yes.
To be able to follow them in your program in different places. Not inflexible, but confident in where you stand.
Right.
You have to be sure of that in order to be able to work with all these different groups of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it comes back to your values, your image of the child, your image of the teacher, the role of the teacher. All of that is intertwined, and yes, you have dialogue with all these different groups of people that you're working with, especially today, when I'm working with groups of people all over the place. You do have to be able to articulate where you're coming from, but to be able to, validate where you're coming from and the type of program you want to run and the kind of curriculum you want to have. Has to be a reason for that, and you have to be able to articulate it.
So we talked a lot about your past. I'd really like to know who inspires you now in ECE.
Oh gosh, there's so many people. Caroline Ween has been a long-time mentor to me. I first met her way back when I was first beginning this journey, and she was doing Saturday workshops at the Mount. I went to one, and I loved what she was saying. It involved the arts, and I loved what she was saying and the way that she facilitated the group. And over so I've known her for decades, and we have just the deepest conversations. And I always say to people when we're mentioning Caroline that she ties me up in cognitive knots, because she asks very thought-provoking questions. We're secure enough with each other that we can challenge each other, and that mentorship, that relationship, that collegiality has lasted for decades. And, we still, try to, if we're on a road trip, we have these great conversations on our way to a conference or something about solving the problems of the ECE world. We have these great conversations, much of which doesn't come to anything, but the ideas are constantly flowing when we're together. So she has been a huge influence. And then, there are, lots of local people like, Liz and the community of practice that we both belong to.
Elizabeth Hicks, by the way.
Yeah. We both belong, you and I, to the same community of practice. That's a great group of thinkers. Christine McLean is there, Caroline, yourself, and Justin, and others. And we have the greatest discussions that are influential in terms of, I think, how I write or what I might write about. So the article that I just wrote, that was the one that was in Innovations, was about the journey of documentation from just simply telling the story to interpretation and reflection, that journey of deeper documentation. And that discussion had come up many times in our community of practice. And so I was able to draw on that to do more writing. And so that community of practice has been really important. And then there are people around the world. There's, Gay Lindsay in New Zealand, who is very much an advocate for the arts in early childhood education. Christy Lilligren in New Zealand, who's developed a fantastic series of books on the arts. I'm very influenced by the arts as a language. And Debbie Keith-Hartland in the UK, in the city where I grew up. And so when I go back to visit my family, I can see Debbie Keith-Hartland in the UK. All these people, even today, have a tremendous influence because of the dialogue that was involved. That dialogue is very important. For thinking together.
Absolutely. It is so hard. You get stuck, right? And sometimes it takes somebody else, even just reframing or reflecting your words to you, and you hear it a different way, and you're like, oh, actually, I mean this.
Yeah, or somebody will say to you in your one-on-one conversation or in a community practice, they'll say, what do you mean by that? And when you say this thing, that you often say, what do you mean by that? And people provoke you to dig a little deeper, and that's always helpful.
I find Carol Ann Lean does that a lot.
Yes.
Anything we say, she's like, okay, let's choose our words correctly.
Yeah.
What do you mean by this word? Because we're going to get to the correct term. Yeah. And I find that kind of reflects the way that I talk to children. Because when I work with children, they'll say something, and I'm like, oh, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? What is your context for this word? And I find that when my mentors or my colleagues use that with me, it really helps me out, just kind of like reframing my own thinking.
And it just makes you dig deeper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're going to link your article right there in the screen, probably somewhere up here. So check that article out. What would you say to ECEs at the beginning of their career? They've completed their training. They're going into the field. What message do you think they need to hear?
So I think, many students have developed some pretty, solid values around how they see the child and what they want to do by the end of their program. And often that gets lost in especially the first year, the survival mode that you're in for that first year. I wish that first year educators just out of their program in Nova Scotia, I wish they had a mentor for that first year. That would be an incredible asset.
What an excellent idea. We should fund that. Allow our new ECEs to have support so that we can move that education forward that we're working so hard to build. Anyway,
because
continue.
it often gets lost.
Yes.
In the hubbub of everyday life and the multitasking, and it's just overwhelming for a first year educator. So, but if you want to hold on to something from your course, I would say, your coursework, I would say if you can hold on to curiosity and to remain curious, if you can, right from the get-go, remember to formulate questions about what you're seeing, to ask questions of your colleagues, and okay, so can you explain to me why we do this thing in a particular way? Respectfully try to find out more,
Mm-hmm.
and to through maybe keep up your documentation so that you have something to take to a staff meeting for discussion, even if it's just a photograph or a snippet of a conversation, to have something to take to talk about, especially something that's interesting to you. So I would say to new educators, if you can hold on to your curiosity. Yes. And hold on to small pieces of documenting, that would be huge. It will see you through your first few years and help you to grow.
Absolutely. Yeah, and a lot of new ECEs think that the documentation is purely for the children or purely for the parents. But you can do your documentation for your own thinking, to share with people, not to be on display. So do those documentation.
We call this raw documentation, rough documentation. Yes. We can do it in a sketch notebook, a post-it notes in a journal, on a clipboard around the classroom, but to keep notes not only of what the children are doing, but what your questions are, what your puzzles are about that, and then take that to the team for discussion.
Absolutely. And nowadays everybody's doing the social media thing, so you can actually post your own, you can create your own video library, video diary for yourself, speaking out your thinking, talking about the events. This is also a form of documentation that you could go back to.
Yeah.
So don't feel like you have to do the documentation that you learned in school. Do what works for you, but document. Yes. Keep those pieces together for your thinking.
In some way, even if it's, I often talk about, and I've worked with educators on a reflective wall, when it's post-it notes and little snippets from children and some mark making from children and photographs. If you can do nothing else, just to get it up there as a thinking tool. So to think with, you look at that mess of raw data, if you want to call it that, and it looks like a mess. It's not meant for display. It's not meant for sharing. It's meant for you to think. Yeah,
exactly. So this is kind of a funny question. For this one, I want to know, what one experience do you think is most important for ECEs or children to have?
I always go back to the arts. I think I am kind of immersed and interested in the arts myself in many different ways. And I think when children are given the opportunity in their day-to-day life to use the arts as a form of expression, certainly that's another language that we can tap into. But we ourselves can use the arts as well, whether we're mark making or using the same materials as the student or needing play and whatever it is, we should be learning to use those materials too. Those are experiences that actually I think with the arts, if you're sitting at the table with children and they're using clay and you're using it too, everybody kind of enters a state of flow, that state of flow. When you're really engaged and your thoughts become quite relaxed but acute at the same time when you're involved with the arts. So I always go back to that. My own classrooms in the past were always very arts based. Whether that was, I would always have 2 double easels. So 4 children can paint at the same time,
right. Yes.
Side by side or on the other side from each other, and they're talking while they're painting and mark making with charcoal, and they're talking while they're using clay, because they're in a state of flow, they're relaxed, and we can listen in on that. It's valuable for them as well as for us. So those are the experiences I really focus in.
So hands-on art experience for both children and ECEs, for everybody, really.
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion on what is one book that every ECE should have on their shelf?
Besides mine, you mean?
Of course. Well, there's also mine, yes.
And Matthews. And oh my gosh, there's so many great writers here in Nova Scotia, in Halifax. I mean, Caroline Wayne has written, several books. I mean, there's all sorts of great stuff out there. But I thought about that when I was thinking about this conversation we were going to have, and I looked at my bookshelf, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's just so many that have been influential for me. But I think there's a book called 10 Best Practices, or 12 Best Practices in Early Childhood Education.
Okay.
And it's written by Anne Lewin Benham. And it contains a lot of information about Reggio, Emilia, because she is the person who actually ran that first school in Washington, D.C. that I visited. So she was the director there at the time. But this was later she wrote this book, and it's like 12 best practices. So it covers all sorts of different type of sort of curriculum approaches or philosophies. But it also talks about relationships with parents and that important communication piece. It's a book I keep going back to and I keep quoting. I've got all these new books on my shelf. I read everything that's coming out of Reggio Emilia, and they are very prolific in their publications. I read all of that, and that, really reaches both my brain and my heart. But for a beginning ECE or a practitioner who doesn't have the time or the wherewithal to read from Reggio Emilia, then 12 Best Practices actually is a very solid, inspiring book that I think would be useful to everybody.
All right, we'll link that above as well, so you can get your hands on that book. And what about books for children that ECEs should have?
Yeah, I love Julia Donaldson's books because of their humor. Their appeal to children, I think, is based on these are situations that children can imagine or see themselves in. Room on the Broom is lots of fun. Of course, the Gruffalo, dealing with the fear of the monster. But my very favorite, and they rhyme, which is really important. That rhyming and that alliteration is so important for children to sort of get into that rhythm of language, which is so beautiful. She does that really well. But my favorite children's book of all time, I brought with me, it's Wilfred Gordon MacDonald Partridge. It's written by Mem Fox, who is Australian.
Okay.
And it is, you can see this is well worn. And it's signed by her.
Ooh.
She did come to Halifax once, a long time ago.
Amazing.
She is a prolific children's writer. Not everybody knows about her. She is humorous. She zeroes in on what children really care about. She writes for children from infancy right through to chapter books at all different stages. She was a literacy instructor when she was a prof.
Okay.
So she knows literacy, but her wording is so articulate and so heartwarming. And this particular story I love because it's about a young child who's like 4, lives next door to an old people's residence, gets to know all the elderly residents, makes relationships with them, and discovers someone who has lost her memory. And his idea is to get her memory back. And so he collects random items from around his house and his yard, like a warm egg from underneath a chicken and one of his puppets and a rock, all sorts of things. And he takes this basket of stuff to this woman who has lost her memory, and it prompts memories for her. Her memories start coming back. Yeah. It's so heartwarming. Yeah. And the last line is, that Miss Nancy recovered her memory because of this young child. And he wasn't very old either. It's like validating the tiny 4-year-old being able to do something like this. It's a fabulous book. It's my all-time favorite.
Amazing. It sounds like it would be a great novel as well.
Yeah, it would. That's a good idea. Yeah.
We're going to rewrite your book, Mem Fox. That is all the questions I had for you today. Is there anything else you would like to tell me about? Anything you'd like to plug? Anything at all?
I would say, in terms of plugging, I would say, pay attention to the great programs that there are in Nova Scotia. Many people have written about them. You have. Justin has had, this beautiful exhibit of the zombie world that became quite well known. Caroline Ween, myself, we've all written about early aspects of early childhood. Many of them, the stories in these books are powerful because they're grounded right here in Nova Scotia. They're the stories of us.
That's right.
So if I'm going to plug anything, I'll plug that. Yeah.
I love that. That goes so well in line with exactly what this podcast is about. There's so much deep knowledge and value in you and all your colleagues' wonderful work over the years that people are missing out on. They think nothing's there, and there's so much rich history, so much rich, meaningful knowledge, and I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your time and your stories. and for giving me some ideas on some other people I might want to contact. And that's all for us today. So again, thank you so much for all your work. Thank you for taking part in this. Thank you for being my first interview. That's amazing. And we'll see you around the neighborhood.
I'll be around. Thanks very much.
Thank you. All right, bye now.